Thank you, Duncan. It's a pleasure to be here tonight with this group. I've done this in the past, and it is a special privilege, really, to be able to address this subject to this particular group, and always an honor, in addition, to be to have in the audience our uniformed military. So welcome, everyone, and also just a quick reminder to a group that needs no reminding the significance of the day. So I hope we all find a little time, if we haven't already, to remember all those who were killed in the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. And part of what we'll do tonight, candidly, is sort of go through the financial situation, debt situation around the world, partly with a view to making sure that we never suffer the financial equivalent of a Pearl Harbor, some kind of attack or catastrophe, foreseeable, possibly preventable, but for whatever reason unforeseen. A couple real quick housekeeping items. I think you'll know this, everything here is at the unclassified level. If anyone's interested, based on anything we discussed or the outline of the materials that are available later, to pursuing any of the dialogue at a different level, that's something that we can arrange. I want to spend a second just on, let's call it the paradigm or the methodology behind what you're going to hear tonight, because we're going to go through a lot of material quickly. We're going to go through a lot of analysis, a lot of conclusions, some policy recommendations, and one question that's logical as well. This is interesting, I'm following this, yeah, it syncs up with a lot of what I know or what I've heard, but what's behind it? What's, we're hearing a lot of conclusions. What's the analysis behind the conclusion? And there is a lot of science behind this. We're going to have a lot of time tonight for facts, analysis, and policy. We're not going to have enough time, unfortunately, to go really deeply into the science of it. I just want to mention briefly that there is science behind it, and that's another discussion we can have. I've been happy to work with Duncan and others up at the Applied Physics Laboratory on exactly those kinds of things. But just to give you a real, just kind of taste of that, or a little foundation for that, my approach to the economic subject is really something that would be very familiar to a lot of you, which is dynamic systems analysis. In other words, you're not going to be hearing from a Keynesian or a monetarist tonight. I'm a little bit of an Austrian, but even that has its limitations. I'll use a lot of behavioral science, as that's applied to the new field of behavioral economics. But what I'm really doing is using systems analysis, no different than you would use in kinetic systems, in critical state systems, and other complex systems, thinking of the economy, capital markets, and interactions in exactly those terms, and then drawing a lot of conclusions from that. And that's a little, definitely different than what they teach you in the PhD finance programs. And it's been an interesting experience because it obviously combines physics and economics. And when I talk to physicists about this, and I've been up at APL and Los Alamos, it's a very eager audience. They're like, this is great, we'd love to research, we get it, we'd love to do more research on this. Really interesting work being done at the Santa Fe Institute, among other places. When I talk to economists about it, they just roll their eyes. They're like, well, what do we have to learn from physicists? So I think it's interesting that in that frontier, that intellectual boundary, the physicists are a lot more, I find, open-minded, willing to reach out and do interdisciplinary work, which I think is the key, than the economists who, unfortunately, for all of us, since they're making a lot of policy, are a little bit in their box. But just one way to put a finer point on it, imagine a car going down the road, hits a patch of ice, it's at night, it's a windy road, conditions are bad, something happens, the driver hits the brakes and the car skids at very high speed. So you're watching this and you're saying, this is going to end badly, this car is going to hit something or go off the road or whatever. But now do a freeze frame. I think our policymakers, and I'll start with Fed Chairman Bernanke, they're looking at the freeze frame and they're saying, there's nothing wrong with that car. There's not a scratch on it. That car is pristine. It's like right out of the showroom. The car is fine. And what I do is I'm studying the ice, I'm studying the momentum, I'm studying the visibility, I'm studying the braking system, the steering system, the surrounding conditions. I'm looking at all those things. I'm saying, well, you're right, there's not a scratch on it, but this is going to have a very bad end, because you don't need a crystal ball. You don't need to be smarter than anyone else. What you do need to do is to understand the dynamics in play. And if you can get that right, a lot of things become very clear to you. If I hold this pen in the air and I release it, and then the instant I release it, I make a forecast. I say, you know what, this pen's going to hit the table. You don't have to be that smart. You don't need a crystal ball. You just need to know a little bit about gravity. So I'm kind of behind. So when I say there's science behind this, it's the understanding of the dynamic systems and the complexity that go into it. So with that, by the way, Friedrich Hayek, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics, said the same thing in 1947. He was an economist, not a physicist, but he said, these economic systems are too complex for anyone to understand, that nobody can model it, nobody can get it right, and the less we interfere, the better. That's not to say we don't need regulation. It is to say we don't need interference, because you're no matter how smart you are, no matter how many smart people you have on your team, you're not going to do a better job than letting some of these things play out. So with that, let's jump in. I don't know how many people here watch CNBC on a regular basis. It's probably hard to do because we all have day jobs. I'm fortunate my day job includes getting to watch CNBC all day. But whether you're watching CNBC or not, they're watching you. So I just thought I'd play a very brief clip. And
the U.S. versus China, it's looking more and more like an economic Cold War, and it's not just a talking point at the Pentagon. They are planning for real economic threats to America. Our Eamon Javers has the latest on the war games that are playing out in some high councils around your parts. Eamon?
Hey, Tyler. Well, you're right. Ever since the crash of 2008, the defense intelligence establishment has really been paying a lot of attention to global markets and how they could serve as a threat to U.S. national security interests. At one upcoming seminar that we're going to see here next month, they're taking a look at a lot of the issues that might be really familiar to CNBC viewers. Take a look at some of the Pentagon's key concerns here. They're looking at the use of sovereign wealth funds to manipulate markets and currencies. They're looking at nation-state economic collapse, sovereign default, and nation-state instability, and they're also worried about U.S. allies' budgets, deficits, and national security infrastructures. And in the Army, they're having a very interesting year-long exercise called Unified Quest 2011. And in that wargaming series, they're looking at the implications of large-scale economic breakdown inside the United States that would force the Army to keep, quote, domestic order among civil unrest, and force the Army to deal with fragmented global power and drastically lower budgets. This according to the trade publication InsideDefense.com. And in October, military officials from the Marine Corps War Colleges visited the trading floor of J.P. Morgan to study markets and the economy. So, Tyler, you can see that all different parts of the Pentagon and defense intelligence establishment are looking at markets and looking at ways they can present a new kind of threat to the United States. These are the guys whose job it is to think about the very worst possible things that could happen, and they've dreamed up some very scary scenarios here.
All right, Eamon, thank you very much. Eamon.
So, because he's talking about a lot of you, I take it, but the point is that what we're going to talk about tonight is not, 3 years ago was a little bit of an esoteric, almost novel type of dialogue. It's completely mainstream. We've all heard Admiral Mullen, Admiral Denny Blair when he was Director of National Intelligence, and other senior figures testify on the Hill that they consider economic threats to be the greatest national security threat today. So this is clearly a widely discussed mainstream kind of subject. So let's just jump right in. The biggest problem in the world today and the biggest economic problem going forward, and something that is inescapable, so what I would say is let's describe it and let's talk about the implications of it, is the sovereign debt crisis. It is quite simply the case that the debt that exists in the world today cannot be repaid. The world is broke. That's a kind of a simple way to think about it. Where how that plays out will take years, but that's a good place to start in terms of understanding it. Where did this come from? Well, runaway deficit spending. I'm not talking about the last 2 years, the last 10 years. This has really been building over 50 years. But deficit spending, on top of baseline deficit spending, which was bad enough, we have fiscal stimulus as a result of the financial panic of 2008. By the way, I don't think of this as a recession or a past recession or even a panic, although clearly there was a panic in 2008. I think of this as a depression that began in 2007, will probably run until 2012, 2013, depending on policy. I mean, you can do some right things or wrong things, but to me the best way to understand it is to understand that we're in a depression. If you go back to the Great Depression, 1934 was one of the best years in the stock market ever prior to 2010. So there's 2009 and 2010. So there's nothing inconsistent about declining unemployment, rising stock markets, rising commodity prices in the middle of a depression. And that's just kind of my frame for understanding it. So we have baseline deficit spending. We have enormous additional fiscal stimulus. By the way, the best science is that stimulus is one of the great misnomers. I don't call it stimulus, I just call it spending. Stimulus does not stimulate anything. And there's been an enormous amount of work on the so-called Keynesian multiplier, which now looks to be a fraction, maybe somewhere between 0.6 and 0.8 at best, and sometimes as low as 0, even negative in some scenarios. Christina Romer went into the White House and wrote a paper, said it was 1.5. And the theory there was if you spend $1 trillion, you get 1.5 trillion of added GDP. Bearing in mind, to spend $1 trillion, you've got to take it from the private sector because there's no place else to get it. And then you're down $1 trillion, you spend $1 trillion, and you get 1.5 of GDP. That's the 1.5 multiplier. My view is if that's true, why don't we spend 2 or 3 and really get rich? But the point is that science has been, that work has been largely discredited. It looks like it's 0.6, 0.7. Robert Barrow at Harvard, John Taylor at Stanford, even the IMF, if you can believe it, have weighed in on this. So that consensus seems to be emerging, which means that stimulus spending destroys wealth, which is feels a lot more intuitively correct. So you take $1 from the private sector, you run it through the government, it's kind of intuitive that you're going to get less at the other end. It doesn't mean 0, but the idea that process destroys wealth makes good intuitive sense, and the science seems to bear that out. So we're not getting anything for a stimulus. And then finally, we've had a massive, massive substitution of public debt for private debt. So let's use Ireland as a kind of a petri dish. So the Irish banks go broke, right? They go broke because they were dopes. So the Irish government bails them out. So suddenly the banks are still standing, but now the Irish government has taken on the debt. Well, now the Irish government's broke. So who's bailing them out? Well, they're being bailed out by a consortium of the European Central Bank. They have a special stabilization fund, and the IMF. All right, so Irish government lifts the bank debt. IMF lifts the Irish government debt. Who supports the IMF? The United States. I mean, there are other countries, but the United States is a big backer of the IMF. All this comes back to the Fed at the end of the day. The Fed is just like the earth source of all the, I won't call it wealth, but I will call it currency in the world. And this has been going on all over the place, from AIG and Bear Stearns, and you know all the names. I don't need to go through them. But my point is, all we did is by bailing out the private system, we didn't solve a problem. We didn't write off the debt. We didn't make it go away. All we did was move it from one bucket to another, from a private bucket to a government bucket. So this has exacerbated the sovereign debt crisis that I described. So this is kind of where we are. Now, how do you get out of it? How do you repay the debt? Well, the traditional way was you basically, you would grow the economy and impose a certain level of taxes, and through an expanding pie and collecting taxes, you'd sort of defease the debt. But we've crossed the threshold. We've crossed the tipping point. We can't do that anymore. If you think of it in a linear programming model, there's no combination of growth and taxes that can defease or pay off the size of the liability. Because our economy is not growing, we're kind of doing 2%, which is not even enough to create enough jobs for all the people entering the workforce, let alone reduce the 8 million unemployed. But apart from that, if you dial up taxes, and again, I'm not trying to make a policy argument pro or anti any of these things. To me, this is beyond ideology. It's beyond politics. This is just math. My point is, if you dial up the taxes, whatever you think of that, you're going to depress the growth. And so, as we think of it in a linear programming space, you cannot get there. You cannot pay off this debt. This first slide is just, these show countries, and these debt levels are as a percentage of GDP. So for example, let's take the United States. Where is the US? Okay. That's about 300% of GDP. Our GDP is 14 trillion approximately, so 3 times that. We have 42 trillion in debt. This is public, private, and business debt combined. Now, why do that? Well, the thing is, you have to look at the private sector debt. You have to look at individual debt. If I owe a lot of money and I have to pay it back, well, in the course of paying it back, I'm not spending it, am I? And so it's that deleveraging, it's that paying off the debt that from the individual up to the government level, except the government's not, that is depressing spending. So you can't, with the deleveraging, you don't get the consumption. Without the consumption, you don't get the growth, you don't get the taxes. You just cannot get there from here. By the way, that 42 trillion, 3 times 14, is grossly understated, because that's only like debt where you actually borrowed it and signed a note and issued some liability. If you throw on contingent liabilities, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, student loans, FHA, Federal Home Loan Bank System, I could keep going, but you get the point. Throw all that in, the number is in excess of $100 trillion. So that's where we are. So now let's talk just briefly about the euro. And the point there is there was massive confusion and misguided policy in Europe about the difference between the currency and the debt. Unfortunately, we're in a place where the market thinks they're the same, which is if you're a sovereign borrower in euros, somehow the quality of the euro is a function of the quality of that debt. Now, there's no reason for that to be true. Think of the United States. If a corporation goes bankrupt, Enron goes bankrupt, nobody thinks that that calls the dollar into question. Just because they borrowed in dollars, they can default. That doesn't make the dollar a bad currency. It just means that they were a bad borrower. So why can't you look at Greece and say, hey, Greece, we know you borrowed in euros, but that's your problem. You got to pay off the debt. The fact that it's denominated in euros doesn't mean anything relative to your capacity to pay the debt. Well, that's not what has happened. That could have happened, but it didn't. What's happened is that these things have become conflated in the eyes of the market and the eyes of policymakers to the point where a euro sovereign default will be considered the equivalent of repudiating the euro, and that's not something Germany wants to see. So on top of everything else I described, we have that particular problem. And I'll just give you a snapshot of Europe. I realize this is too small to read, but you'll get the materials and you can study this as you like. But what you can see clearly is, the red are the critical cases, Ireland, Portugal, Greece. The orange are problematic, may get to a critical stage. The lighter colors up to the yellow are financially sound, at least for the time being. And what you have is a very obvious core periphery type of problem. If you think about how empires collapse, they collapse at the periphery, at least initially. And if you think of how other empires conquer and expand, they expand at the periphery. So here you've got sort of a classic case, almost like the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. Not clear how this is going to play out. There are a couple different ways. Germany could rescue everybody, but they're not going to do that for free. I think you'll see some very coercive terms. Oh, you want to bail out? Fine, but your bondholders are going to have to take a haircut. You're going to have to get your fiscal house in order. We're going to have centralized fiscal policy with Germany calling the shots. So almost like a fourth Reich, a fourth financial Reich in Europe. That's one way of resolving this. Germany wants the euro, by the way. They benefit a lot from the euro because their exports are very competitive in Europe. I mean, leave aside the rest of the world. And the fact that the euro is collapsing relative to other currencies also helps them because it helps them pick up market share in China and North America. So a unified but declining euro is a twofer for Germany. They dominate their home market and get market share around the world. But there's a kind of a price to pay for that, and we'll see how much tolerance the German people actually have for that. But that's kind of one way out. The other way out are just the collapse of the euro and maybe a retreat to a core euro area, which might be Germany, Austria, Finland, the Netherlands. There are 4 or 5 countries that could probably go it alone and still have a valuable currency, but that's kind of the issue they're facing. Now, I said before that this debt is not going to be repaid. It cannot be repaid. So how do you get out of that? Well, there are actually several classic ways of defaulting, and let's put default in quotation marks. There's the outright default, so I'm just not going to pay you, right? That would probably happen in a deflationary collapse where the economy, we're back to the Great Depression and people just don't pay. And that is what happened in the Great Depression. The great debt crisis of the 20s and 30s had to do with World War I reparations imposed on Germany as a result of the Versailles Treaty. Now, you're pretty familiar with that, but Germany owed the money to Britain and France in reparations, totally unpayable. There was no way Germany ever could have repaid that, at least not without a lot more sacrifice than they were prepared to make. But France and England had war debts to the United States. We funded them regularly by buying their bonds. They then imposed that debt on Germany by way of reparations. So Germany couldn't pay Britain and France. Without the reparations, Britain and France could not pay the United States. In the deflationary collapse of the 1930s, that debt was not repaid. President Hoover issued a moratorium on war debts, in 1929, but as a quid pro quo, he insisted that the British and French put a moratorium on reparations as well, and then that was sort of buying time. At the end of the day, none of that debt was repaid. So there's your deflationary collapse where you just don't pay. The other way out is confiscatory taxation. So I pay you, but I'm the government, so here's your money, but there's a 90% tax. Give it back, thank you very much. Third way out is an inflationary default, a hyperinflation. So I owe you $1 trillion. Here's your trillion. Good luck buying a loaf of bread because I printed all the money. Just print the money and give it to you, and it's not worth anything, but I paid you back, right? So deflation, confiscatory taxation, and hyperinflation are three ways out. So when I said it won't be repaid, I mean that in real terms. In nominal terms, it may be repaid in greatly debased currency, and that's what we should expect. Or maybe some combination of the above. Now, I'm a big fan of Neil Young, and somebody once criticized Neil Young and said, all your songs sound alike. And Neil Young turned around and said, well, it's all one song. And when you think about the debt crisis, you look at Dubai, you look at Greece, you look at Ireland, you're like, these have similar characteristics. And my message tonight is, it's all one crisis. This is a global sovereign debt crisis. Nobody can pay. It's just a matter of time before all those chips fall. We'll see how that plays out. So what happens in the short run? What happens while we're waiting for this scenario to play out? The answer is you have currency wars, and a currency war has broken out. When the pie is expanding, when global growth is, when the economy is growing, people don't worry too much about trade advantage. They're like, hey, you got a little edge on me, or I think you're being a little sketchy with your exchange rate, but it's okay because I'm making enough money, my people are happy, the pie's growing, it's fine even though I don't like it. But when the pie's shrinking, people fight over crumbs because there's not enough to go around, particularly with a debt overhang. And so it's in precisely these deflationary, declining growth scenarios where the currency wars break out because that's a way to get an edge on your opponent. And just to flip to the next slide, you all learned this in your first week of macroeconomics, but definition of GDP is consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports, exports minus imports. And that's all there is. I mean, it's a tautology, it's a definition, but that's it. Now, the problem today is that consumption is flat or declining because of the personal deleveraging I described. Investment, a little pickup last year, but that's starting to flatten out a little bit because think of it, you're a businessman. Are you going to invest in plant and equipment when the end user isn't buying your stuff? Probably not. Government spending, that was the big thing in 2009. That $1 trillion of government spending got us through 2009 and 2010. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But now there's a backlash between the Tea Party and the Republicans taking the House. Fiscal policy, I would have said it's off the table until last night, 6 o'clock last night. We learned that we're going to get, this is really the fourth stimulus because President Bush had one, President Obama had two, and this is now the fourth in this bipartisan series of stimulus. I like the compromise. Republicans wanted tax cuts for the rich. Obama wanted tax cuts for the poor, and they said tax cuts for everybody, but no spending cuts to go with it. So I actually, I think tax cuts are good. I think it will help the economy, but without the spending cuts, you're just making the problem that I just described worse. So this is where your currency wars break out, because when C, I, and G aren't doing it for you, you go to net exports. Net exports is the only thing that can drive an economy when consumption, investment, and government spending are not doing it. And how do you get your exports up? You debase, you cut your currency, you devalue your currency. And this is why currency wars, beggar thy neighbor, devaluations break out in times of economic stagnation, because that's the only way I can get an edge. The problem, of course, is that everyone's trying to cut against everyone else all at the same time, and it cannot be done. We can't devalue against Mars. So this happened in the Great Depression. It's happening again. I'm continually amazed that people say, well, we don't want to repeat the mistakes of the 30s. Well, that's a good sentiment. I've yet to see a policy or a development that doesn't exactly mirror the 1920s and the 1930s, which suggests to me that what I said at the beginning about the car, there's a dynamic going on that your policy isn't going to change. So we're kind of dealing with that. So when net exports are the only source of growth, that's when currency wars begin. Here's a couple things. Think of it in strategic terms, maybe tactical terms, actually. All advantage is temporary. So I devalue against you, but next week you devalue against me, and so whatever edge I got, it goes away pretty quickly. Escalation is inevitable because it is a zero or negative sum game, and so the only way to get an edge is to do more of it. Escalation includes, I say escalation is inevitable. I'm reminded of President Eisenhower's comment that if you can't solve a problem, enlarge the problem, make the problem bigger. He meant it in a positive sense of getting a bigger scope on things, but here it's in the negative sense of just continuing the escalation. Escalation includes capital controls. So you think my currency is undervalued, you want to invest in my economy and buy property in my country, fine, I'm putting up gates. They're not tariffs, they're capital controls. You can't come in. Or if you come into my economy, you can't get out. You're here for a long time. We haven't seen that really since the 70s and the early 80s. They're coming back in a small way. I think that'll get bigger. Currency wars lead very quickly to trade wars. You know what that's about. Gold plays a role. We'll talk some more about that. And then ultimately shooting wars, which is what happened in the 1930s after, when Germany devalued against France and Germany refused to pay reparations to France. France invaded the Ruhr Valley and said, what we lawyers call self-help. They just started stripping the coal and the steel and the fat, literally putting on railroad cars and sending it back to France. Germany was defenseless, and their Chancellor Hitler said, we ought to rearm, and we know how that played out. So that's how these things go. The political backlash against the bailouts, not just in the United States, but globally, in these sovereign debt bailouts is beginning, and it's getting stronger. And the instructive case is Iceland versus Ireland. Two relatively small economies, both broke. Iceland just outright defaulted. They took the we're not paying you solution. Their economy collapsed, unemployment went up, their currency was discredited, they were the outcasts of the world. But guess what? Today, Iceland has one of the highest growth rates of any economy because the good thing about hitting bottom is you got nowhere to go but up. Their currency is so cheap. Tourism is up, exports are up, employment is growing. The great thing about defaulting on your debt is you default on your debt. You don't have to pay it. You leave it behind you. Your net worth actually goes up. It becomes your creditor's problem. So that's what Iceland did. Ireland is playing ball. Ireland's in the euro. They're getting a euro bailout. They're bailing out the banks. They're not writing off the debt. But let me show you a quick clip to give you some sense of what's going on. You know that in addition to national parliaments, there's a European Parliament. This is a member of the European Parliament about 2 weeks ago.
Mr. Co-President Nigel Farage, freedom and democracy.
Well, good morning, Mr. Van Rompuy. You've been in office for 1 year, and in that time, the whole edifice is beginning to crumble. There's chaos. The money's running out. I should thank you. You should perhaps be the pin-up boy of the Eurosceptic movement. But just look around this chamber this morning. Just look at these faces. Look at the fear. Look at the anger. Poor old Barroso here looks like he's seen a ghost. You know, they're beginning to understand that the game is up. And yet, in their desperation to preserve their dream, they want to remove any remaining traces of democracy from the system. And it's pretty clear that none of you have learned anything. You know, when you yourself, Mr. Van Rompuy, say that the euro has brought us stability, I suppose I could applaud you for having a sense of humour, but isn't this really just the bunker mentality? You know, your fanaticism is out in the open. You talked about the fact that it was a lie to believe that the nation-state could exist in a 21st century globalised world. Well, that may be true in the case of Belgium, who haven't had a government for 6 months, but for the rest of us, right across every member state in this union, and perhaps this is why we see the fear in the faces, increasingly people are saying, we don't want that flag, we don't want the anthem, we don't want this political class, we want the whole thing consigned to the dustbin of history. And we had the Greek tragedy earlier on this year, and now we have the situation in Ireland. Now I know that the stupidity and greed of Irish politicians has a lot to do with this. They should never ever have joined the euro. They suffered with low interest rates, a false boom and a massive bust. But look at your response to them. What they're being told, as their government's collapsing, is that it would be inappropriate for them to have a general election. In fact, Commissioner Wren here said they had to agree their budget first before they'd be allowed to have a general election. Just who the hell do you think you people are? You are very, very dangerous people indeed. Your obsession with creating this Euro state means that you're happy to destroy democracy. You appear to be happy for millions and millions of people to be unemployed and to be poor. Untold millions must suffer so that your Euro dream can continue. Well, it won't work, because it's Portugal next. With their debt levels of 325% of GDP, they're the next ones on the list, and after that, I suspect it'll be Spain. And the bailout for Spain would be 7 times the size of Ireland, and at that moment, all of the bailout money has gone. There won't be any more. But it's even more serious than economics, because if you rob people of their identity, if you rob them of their democracy, then all they are left with is nationalism and violence. I can only hope and pray that the Euro project is destroyed by the markets before that really happens.
Thank you. The next speaker, Madam.
Okay, so I thought twice about putting that in because he's such a good speaker. I said they're not going to listen to me after that guy. But the point is that's the pushback. That's not the majority opinion in Europe, but that is a very large segment of popular opinion. What he's saying is, why are the Irish people suffering austerity? Why are their elections being put off so you can pay the bondholders of the banks? Why not just stiff the bondholders, say, you know what, you made a bad investment, sorry, too bad for you, but we're going to spend more money at home and help employment. You're going to be hearing more about that in your hearing in this country. So let's flip to quantitative easing, one of our favorite subjects. And the number one question I get when I talk to people around the world, that there's a lot of confusion and people haven't seen an economy play out quite the way it's playing out now. The number one question I get is, are we in for inflation or deflation? Because if you tell me the answer to that, then I know what to do. I know what kind of portfolio to construct and how to invest and all that. And the answer is, I don't know. But I do know the following, that all the data of price stability, PPI, CPI, producer price index, consumer price index, PC, price deflator, which is Bernanke's favorite measure of inflation, are all close to zero. They're what economists call well-behaved. But that's a little bit like saying California is geologically stable because it's not shaking right now. What's going on beneath the surface is you have a massive natural deflation, which happens when you get deleveraging and depression. There is policy-induced inflation, which is what's supposed to happen when you print $1 trillion. The inflation and the deflation are like these tectonic plates. They're coming together. It's not shaking right now, but it's unbelievably unstable, and it's going to break. So which way will it break? My view is that one of two things will happen. Either the Fed will get cold feet. There'll just come a time when the criticism is so great, the money printing is so extensive, the program is so unsuccessful, they'll just have to stop, whether it's politically or they actually believe that's the right thing to do. And then the deflation will take over. That's the natural sequence. My concern is that they'll have faith in their capacity to create inflation by money printing, but they'll find that that's a dynamically unstable process, and you'll go very quickly to hyperinflation, that it won't, this notion that you can dial it up to 2%, and if it gets to 2.5%, we'll dial it down a little bit. That may work in the thermostat in your home. It does not work in a complex system where there are tipping points and critical thresholds, and things can very quickly get away from you. So that's really my concern. If I had to guess right now, I would say that we'll have QE3, QE4, and a dollar collapse in due course, but we'll come back to that a little bit. So just to, another way to think about it is it's what I call the quantum of pain. And what I mean by that is when you misallocate capital, which is when interest rates are too low, too long, it's too easy to borrow money, too easy to make bad investments, the threshold's really low. When you misallocate capital, the capital must be destroyed. It's non-productive, it doesn't pay its own cost of carry, and it must be destroyed. You can physically destroy it. Actually, blowing up houses, it would be one way to do it. Or you can financially destroy it by writing it down. Something that was $10 million is now going to be on your books at $5 million, and $5 million of capital has simply gone away. But we're not actually seeing that. What's happening is that the Fed is trying to prop up asset prices, maintain the system. I call it catching an anvil in midair. It's like, nice job catching the anvil. What's your next move? But that's kind of what they're doing now. Now, what you can do with these losses, you can shift them in time. Instead of concentrating them in a 1 or 2 year period, you can stretch them out over 10 years. The problem with that is, my view is that Americans have a high tolerance for pain and a huge appetite for growth. So if you say we're going to have a depression, we're going to have 18% unemployment, like we haven't seen since 1932, but once we wring all that rot out of the system, we're poised for very rapid growth after that. I think the American people have a tolerance for that. At least we have in the past. I'm not sure the American people have tolerance for 10 years or 20 years of no growth, because that's the alternative. That, again, you don't get robust growth. What you do is you stretch out the stagnation. The other thing you can do is you can shift the cost to different losers. In other words, the people who should lose are the banks and the bondholders who financed all this stuff. But instead, you can say, all right, we're going to bail out the bondholders and shift the loss to the taxpayers. Now, again, go back to my premise of the quantum of pain. The loss is still there, but we've shifted it from a deserving set of players to arguably an undeserving set of players, which are average citizen and taxpayers. I'm not sure politically that that's very stable. But these are kind of the only ways out. It's the V versus the L. Now, this is an illustration. This is the housing bubble. So a lot of you may have participated. It's just kind of normalized to 100. Go back to 2000. There are longer time series here, but 2000 to 2000, late 2006, early 2007 was the housing bubble. Now, obviously, the housing collapsed. But one thing about the dynamics of bubbles, and you can look at the Nikkei index, which was 40,000 in 1989. It's about 7,000 or 8,000 today. There are many, many examples I could give you. The NASDAQ, which was 5,000 in 2000 and is 2,000 something today, down. These numbers are down 60 or 80% from their peaks 10, 20, and 30 years after the peak. What happens in a bubble is that the collapse goes all the way down to the starting point and usually overshoots. In other words, my forecast for housing would be it's down here, it's below where it started, down another 30% from where it is today. I know that's not news that anybody wants to hear, but that's how bubbles work. So what happened here? It went back up. Look, how did that flatten out? That's the first-time homebuyer tax credit. We spent the money, we printed the money, we kept that thing from going lower, but what happened? Remember, there were two. It went back up a little bit. Then they got to the end of the homebuyer tax credit. It collapsed again, and then they came up with a new tax credit to get it going. Now that's over, and look what's happening. It's going down again. In other words, this is like a force of nature. This propping up is policy, and it works for a while, but it's not free because you're destroying the dollar in the process. You're debasing the dollar. Now, if you get to a self-sustaining recovery, things get better, growth goes up, you tax more, you pay back the debt, you unwind the whole transaction. But that is not happening. It's not happening because this never got down to there. And that's what I mean by the quantum of pain. That's why this is I understand this in dynamic space. So the Fed wants inflation. Because inflation, 4% inflation for 17 years cuts the value of the dollar in half. And that 100 trillion I talked about, if it's 50 trillion, we might be able to pay 50 trillion. We just can't pay 100 trillion. So they need that kind of inflation. The Fed chairman says 2%. That is not true. He wants 4. My problem is you don't get 2, you don't get 4, you get 12 or -5. But the idea that you can fine tune it is, I think, an illusion. So let's talk a little bit about how you try to get inflation anyway, which is, of course, by printing money. Now, this is what most people consider to be money, but it's actually a contract between you and your government. This is a contract between the citizens and the United States government. And I always say, as a lawyer, read the fine print, read the contract. So let's just take this contract out of your pocket and read it. And the first thing I notice is the word note. Now, where I went to law school, a note was a liability, and indeed it is. When the Fed prints money, it shows up as a liability on the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve System. So you can call it money, and it is legal tender over there, but it's really debt. It's debt issued by a central bank. And so even what we call money is really debt. And we use it to incur more debt, more leverage, so it's all debt. There's very little capital left in the world. And so printing money, just if you say printing debt every time you hear that, you kind of get a little insight into how that works. Now, why are we not getting the inflation? I heard someone say the other day, this government isn't even competent enough to produce inflation. They're not even doing a good job of debasing the dollar. Well, there's a reason for that. The reason is China. Because of the exchange rate mechanism between the United States and China, because China has pegged the yuan to the dollar, they have in effect outsourced their monetary policy to us. Now, they didn't think we would do this to them, but we are. And so what's happening is if you're a Chinese exporter and you ship goods to the United States and you get paid in dollars, the People's Bank of China says you have to hand those dollars over to them, and they give you yuan. They give you some local currency. Then you can use that to meet your payroll and pay your suppliers and all that stuff, so that's fine. But in order to soak up the quantity of dollars that we're pumping out and keep that exchange rate fixed, they've got to flood their own system with their own currency. So they're getting inflation in China. They're getting a lot of inflation in China, but it's coming from Washington. In other words, they're importing our inflation through the exchange rate mechanism. That's why we're not getting the inflation we want. And that's why Bernanke's not getting any traction. What's going on now is an extremely dangerous, high-stakes game of chicken between China and the United States, where the Federal Reserve is trying to break the peg between the yuan and the dollar by creating so many dollars that the Chinese finally choke on it and have to break the peg, revalue the yuan upwards, raise their own interest rates to get a lid on their inflation. When that happens, and watch for that, because when that happens, the inflation is coming back home. You're going to see the inflation in this country. We won't be exporting it to China anymore. One problem. Why did China set that peg in the first place? So that their exports would be competitive, so they could create jobs, because they got 25 million people a year marching in from the countryside saying, give me a job. And if they don't get a job, they've got political instability. So they're between a rock and a hard place. They're either going to revalue the yuan upwards, which could put a lid on inflation but hurt exports and create social instability, or they're going to keep the peg, which creates inflation, which creates social instability. So China is in a very, very tenuous position. I think what the Chinese are doing, what they will do, is price controls. In other words, they're going to try to have it both ways. They're going to try to keep the peg, but put a lid on inflation. Now, price controls usually don't work. In the long run, they won't work in China. But they have a much more coercive society. They still use firing squads when it suits their purposes. And they put on serious price controls, and then a couple of months go by, they'll find a violator, stand them up in front of a firing squad, shoot the guy, and that's like a message to them. So they might be more successful than some other countries, at least in the short run, at actually putting on price controls. So this battle could go on a while longer and could become a lot more unstable as the Fed continues to print money to break the peg. But that's what's going on between the U.S. and China. Very, very high-stakes stuff. Now, what is it what's the other thing that's causing inflation not to pick up in the United States? Well, this, again, another very simple, it's not even it's barely an equation, it's really a tautology, but it's good for thought experiments. This is the monetarist holy grail, right? So it's money, M is money supply, V is velocity, P is a price index, and Y is real growth. Yeah. So what it says is take the amount of money, multiply it by the turnover in the money, and that equals nominal growth, which has two components, inflation and real growth. What's velocity? Well, velocity is, I take a taxi to the airport tonight, and I pay the taxi driver a tip. He goes out and buys a cup of coffee, and the guy who sold him the coffee buys a present for his daughter, right? So that money had velocity of 3. That $1 got turned over 3 times. But if I take $1 and put it in the bank, that has velocity of 0. Now, in the real world, there's all different kinds of things going on with the money, so you look at it as an aggregate. But the problem is, if velocity is going down, which it is, you have to print money just to stay even. You have to print money just to keep the GDP from going down. If velocity goes down 50%, your economy goes down 50%, from 14 trillion to 7 trillion, unless you double the money supply. So this is the other battle that Bernanke's fighting. Not only that the fact that the Chinese are taking the inflation that he's trying to get, but he's running up a hill with a 50-pound backpack on because of the decline in velocity. Now, Milton Friedman, who kind of invented this whole school of thought, said he believed that velocity was more or less constant. And in his lifetime, his productive lifetime, it was. From 1950 to 1980, velocity was constant at about 1.1. But over a longer time series, you can see that actually velocity is highly volatile. This is the stretch from 1950 to 1980. That's when Milton Friedman did all his work. And what economists assumed was if you hold velocity constant, right, then all you have to do is dial up or dial down the money supply, and you'll get nominal GDP. And if you furthermore say that real GDP can only grow about 3%, because it's, what is this, 1% population plus 2% or so technological innovation, so it's population plus productivity. There's nothing else in GDP. So if you can only grow about 3 or 4%, dialing up the money supply more than that will increase inflation if you hold velocity constant. The problem is velocity is not constant. You can see it peaked in 1998. Prior peak was 1918. 10 years later, you had the stock market crash. 10 years after 1998, you had 2008. Now, velocity has continued to decline from this level. This chart's about a year old. But again, Bernanke's swimming into a very strong current because of the decline of velocity, and then the Chinese are out there throwing rocks at him because of the yuan peg. So you have some sympathy for the fact that you can't get inflation, assuming inflation is something you want. It has its own problems. So I said velocity is going down, so money supply has to go up. Where's the evidence of that? There's your money supply. Now, imagine you were a pilot trying to fly this flight path. You wouldn't make it. That's pretty steep, but Fed doesn't have this kind of aerodynamics to worry about. That's, money is, by the way, this is before QE2. Sorry, this is before QE2. QE2 will take it off the charts. Remember Al Gore in Inconvenient Truth when he had the scissor lift to show how bad things could get? Well, you're going to need that to show where the money supply is going. It's on its way to $3 trillion. By the way, the capital of the Federal Reserve is $57 billion. So if you take the $3 trillion and just haircut it by 2%, the Fed is broke. The Fed's capital on a mark-to-market basis is probably negative. So we have a central bank of issue that itself is broke because they're not buying good assets. They bought $1.4 trillion of mortgages. How are they doing? They bought stuff from Bear Stearns. Then the old Fed used to buy 30-day Treasury bills. It's the safest investment in the world. The new Fed's buying CMBS, junk, mortgage-backed securities, stuff originated by Countrywide, and they're buying 7-year notes, which are good from a credit point of view, but they're highly volatile. Think about, Bernanke said he can deal with inflation by selling the bonds and taking the money out of the system. Yeah, that's true in theory, but what is the world where that's happening? The world where that's happening is the world where interest rates are going up. What happens to the price of a 7-year bond in a rising interest rate environment? Well, bond prices move inversely to interest rates. So the time when you want to do that is the time when the prices are going to come down. They're going to lose money in the unwind and go broke. So we're looking at the possibility of a bankrupt Fed. It's just, like I say, it's not math. It's not a political presentation. All right, so where is this all leading? This is a dynamic model of how the dollar will collapse, and it's pretty simple. So just make up numbers, 311 million people, it's a nice round number for a population in the United States. I have case one, case two. For any of you who are physicists, deal in fissile materials or other dynamic critical state systems, this will all seem like very familiar stuff. So T is a threshold. T is a level where that's my threshold. So when I see somebody act in a quantity greater than T, I act. So case one, we're subcritical. So what happens is 1,000 people reject the dollar, right? So 1,000 people reject the dollar, but for the next group, sorry, did I do this right? Oh no, sorry, 500 people reject the dollar. And then at that point, I'm sorry, there's my premise. So, okay, assume 100 people repudiate the dollar. So this is what happens. 100 people reject the dollar. Well, when 100 people reject the dollar, the next 1,000 people had a threshold of 500. In other words, if 500 people reject the dollar, they would reject it also. Their critical threshold is 500. But what happened is 100 people rejected the dollar. It wasn't 500. It fell below the critical threshold. So nothing else happened. That phenomena died out right at that level because that number is less than that number. Now, let's change it. And I'm only going to change two variables. I'm going to make the 500 100 over there, and I'm going to make the 10,000 1,000. But the bottom three are the same. Everything else in this system is the same. Now, 100 people reject the dollar. Well, what happens? Well, at 100, you've triggered the threshold for 1,000. So now 1,000 people reject the dollar. At that 1,000, you've triggered the threshold for 1,000,000. Now 1,000,000 people reject the dollar. Now the next threshold was 100,000. Well, we had 1,000,000, so we're over that. So now 10 million people reject the dollar. At 10 million, you've hit the next threshold, 100 million. The next threshold was 50. We crossed that with 100, so 200 million people. In the aggregate, the entire population of the United States rejects the dollar. This is exactly like you're in a movie theater and 3 people get up and they run out. And you say, that's odd. But you sit there, like your threshold is higher than 3. You think it's odd, but you don't want to get up and run out yourself. But now you're sitting there, 10 people run out. You're like, something's up. They know something I don't know. The place is on fire. I don't know. I'm out of here. In other words, there's an example where at 3, you haven't hit my critical threshold, but at 10, you have. So it's exactly like everyone running out of a crowded theater. It's exactly what happens in a chain reaction. You know, a 35-pound block of uranium in a cube is pretty harmless. You'd have to eat it to get sick. But if you shape it into a softball in a barrel and put it in a tube and fire it together, you can blow up a city. Same uranium. It has to do with the array and how you start a chain reaction. This is how you start a chain reaction in the dollar. So one last thing. This is the maturity structure of national debt of major countries. So this is take the entire national debt, because we issue 30-day notes, 6-month notes, 1-year notes, all the way up to 30-year bonds. So take the weighted average of all that debt, and what is that number? Well, in the United States, it's about 4 years. Think of these as seconds. Imagine you have a hand grenade and you pull the pin, and the question is, how long will it take before that hand grenade explodes? Well, if you're England, you got 12 seconds. If you're the US, you got 4 seconds. We have almost the shortest maturity structure of any major country in the world. The reason for that is we used to spread it out. That number used to be close to 7, which is a much more comfortable number. But interest rates for shorter maturities are lower. So if I issue a 6-month bill, I pay about 20 basis points. But if I issue a 30-year bond, I have to pay about 3%. So you have almost 3 percentage points. So if I issue the shorter maturity, I pay less interest this year. That helps the deficit. But there's a price to pay, which is that interest rate saving in the short run. Think of it as a premium that you receive for selling insurance to the world. The U.S. is short volatility. So another way to think of it, just think of it as a fuse on a bomb. We have a very short fuse. So go back to the last slide of what the critical dynamic is and look at this slide. Realize we have a very short period of time. By the way, this doesn't mean we have to pay off the debt in 4 years. That's not what it means. What it means is that on average, we roll it over every 4 years. And so you're constantly going back to the market. So it wouldn't take much to get this going. And if it did get going, we'd have very small margin for error. So this is a major threat for the United States. So what do we got? In summary, debt cannot be repaid. Inflation is one answer. But I've suggested that the process of inflating is dynamically unstable. You could cross those thresholds that I just showed you, and the result in due time would be a collapse of the dollar. So this is the threat that we're facing, and it's cumulative and not going away. Now, I had a section in the outline on state capitalism, what I call China, Russia, and state capitalism. It's very well detailed in the outline. I'm actually going to cut back on my comments a little bit because I want to save time for a lot of other things we want to cover. But just kind of briefly, and again, there's a lot more detail in the outline. What we're seeing in Beijing in particular, but also somewhat in Russia, is what I call neo-mercantilism. Neo-mercantilism is a more technical term for state capitalism. It's actually not a new school of economics, if you will, or economic behavior. If you go back prior to the 18th century, or prior to the 19th century, in the 17th and 18th centuries, mercantilism was the predominant economic mode. And what it really says is that classical mercantilism says that wealth is in tangible things: land, gold, silver, other fine art. That was wealth. And the way you got wealth, you could create a little bit of it, but you didn't have very productive economies in those days. There was really the Industrial Revolution that led to a revolution in productivity. The way you got wealth through thousands of years of history was you stole it. You went and attacked somebody and took their stuff, and left them destitute, and you got their stuff. And that's what wars were about. That's how people got rich. They attacked people, they invaded people, they blockaded people, they had pirates, you name it, but you just sort of took the other guy's wealth, and because you couldn't create that much of your own. But it was really, it took on a policy cast and involved export subsidies, import tariffs, exclusivity in trading relationships, trading blocks. So the British Commonwealth is a classic example of a trading bloc. Basically, the acquisition of wealth was predominantly, not exclusively, but predominantly a zero-sum game. And to paraphrase Clausewitz, trade was the continuation of war by other means. Now, beginning in the mid-19th century in England and becoming much more prevalent in the United States and globally in the 20th century was what's called the Washington Consensus. It's based on the idea of comparative advantage. And just to, for those of you who don't recall, again, Econ 101, imagine a very simple economy. There are only two people in the economy, Tom Brady and me. And there are only two things to do in this economy, play football or mow the lawn. Those are the only two things you get to do. So we can kind of stipulate that Tom Brady plays football better than I do, so we get that. But he probably mows the lawn better than I do too, because he's younger, he's more fit, he's an athlete. So in a mercantilist society, Tom Brady would play all the football and he'd mow his own lawn, and I'd be poor and starving to death. That's what a mercantilist economy looks like. But in an economy of free trade and comparative advantage, you say, well, he may mow the lawn better than I do, but that spread is kind of thin, whereas in football, he's way ahead of me. So it really makes sense for him to play football all the time and make more money and then pay me to mow his lawn, even though I don't do it as well as he does. That's still a better deal for him because he'll make more money playing football. Even after he pays me, he's better off, and I'm definitely better off because now I got a job mowing the lawn. So that's a case where even though you do everything better, you do some things way better, and if you concentrate on those and let the other guy do the things that where the gap is narrower, everybody's better off. That is a very strong intellectual foundation. It works, and that's comparative advantage, free trade, and this is what we call the Washington Consensus. And what does that require? It requires free trade area, low tariffs. I mean, you can have it in a suboptimal world, but to move towards optimality, the fewer barriers, the better. So get rid of capital controls, get rid of tariffs, freely convertible currencies, free flows of capital interest and dividends, very few, if any, restrictions on direct foreign investment, mobility of labor, reciprocity and non-discrimination and expansion of global companies, protection of intellectual property, protection of creditors, some kind of system of bankruptcy, reasonable antitrust laws, no protectionism, and general adherence to the rule of law. I realize I went through that quickly, but you get the sense it's a package of kind of advanced, reasonable, fair ideas that this was the engine really going back to the 1980s, 1990s, early part of the 21st century. This was the engine of globalization. And this was how wealth was maximized. Now, there is emerging, in contrast to that, what's called the Beijing Consensus. And I think it applies to Russia and some others as well. And the United States has assumed in policy that, you know what, give China a break. You know, it wasn't that long ago they were in the Cultural Revolution or the Great Leap Forward. Before that, they had, chaos for 100 years from the fall of the Ming Dynasty through the Communist Revolution in 1949. And they've come a long way. Let's give them credit for that. Let's not nitpick too much the places where they fall short because they're moving in the right direction. That was Washington's view of how to treat China. It's becoming more and more apparent that China is not conforming to that view. They do to a point, but they're not moving nearly as far in our direction as they are capable of doing, and they're beginning to show their true colors. They're beginning to show this neo-mercantilist bent. We're seeing a lot of examples. You also saw the imposition of quotas and bans on rare earth exports. China and Russia both have captive gold mining industries at this point. The way they're building up their gold reserves without having market impacts is they're actually capturing the input of their own mines at below market levels. Large and growing state sector, the players, Gazprom, Sinopec, China Investment Corporation. We're seeing an emerging German, Russian axis. By the way, there's been a lot of criticism of the post-Cold War unipolar world and a desire to see a more multilateral world. I think we see that particularly in this administration. The problem is the alternative to unipolarism is not multilateralism. The alternative is unilateralism. In other words, once you no longer have a boss, it's every man for himself or every woman for herself. The point being, countries are all going their own way. They're not falling in line between a sort of a kumbaya, let's all sit around the table. They're just saying, let's cut a deal because the United States is no longer providing the kind of leadership we require. So these problems are, they're not residuals or artifacts, but it's a new and expanding phenomena. Neo-mercantilism is actually rational in a world of declining marginal returns due to complexity. In other words, if you're actually in a negative sum or zero sum world, you should be really good at playing a zero sum game. And the United States is still playing a positive sum game, but that may not sync up with the reality of economic growth today. And I like to say victory in a negative sum game is still a victory. So kind of where China is coming from. This neo-mercantilist state capitalist vector is independent of the sovereign debt crisis and the crisis of inflation that I just described. But I'm not trying to pile on, but maybe I am. I'm saying that we have multiple crises, multiple vectors that relate to each other that are converging. This would be a problem even if we were in a world of growth, even if we did not have the sovereign debt problems I described for a lot of reasons. But coming on top of the world I described, it reinforces this kind of negative sum game mentality. So we talked about debt, we talked about mercantilism. There's kind of a lot of gloomy news, but I'm going to finish or work towards the end with a little bit of good news. The United States has a secret weapon. We have an extremely powerful financial secret weapon. We seem reluctant to acknowledge it, reluctant to use it, but the United States is a gold superpower. Now, if you think that, well, I'll explain it. It's a very good question. Thank you for asking that question. Let me explain exactly what I mean by that. But what I've done is, we're all very familiar with oil, right? So you look around the world, some people have a lot of oil, some people use a lot of oil, some people have it and use it, some people just need it, don't have it. There has to be transported, there are strategic choke points. We're all very familiar with thinking about the world in oil space in terms of production, use, reserves, and transportation. Think about the world in gold space for a minute. By the way, if you think that gold is not money, and if you think that gold has no role in global finance, you can get home early because I'm going to talk about it for the next 15 minutes. But historically, I think I've got 7,000 years of history on my side versus about 30 or 40 years on the other side, so I will talk about it. By the way, for those of you who remember Goldfinger, like a lot of younger people haven't seen it, you say, oh yeah, I remember that movie. You say, what was it about? I was like, well, Goldfinger was a bad guy, and he was going to steal all the gold in Fort Knox, and James Bond and Felix Leiter shut him down. Well, that's wrong on two counts. Remember, Goldfinger wasn't going to steal the gold. He knew he couldn't do it. He was going to blow it up with a nuclear device, so his gold would be more valuable. He was going to destroy the gold, not steal it. And he was not really the bad guy. He was a front man or an agent. Anybody remember who gave him the nuclear device and who was behind Goldfinger's plot? It was China. Funny how that plays out. So, so now this is, for those of you with children, or maybe when you were children, you remember one of the most popular features on Sesame Street is a little IQ test. Which of these is not like the other? And kids love this, it's one of their favorite things. And I've shown this in audiences of professors of economics from Ivy League and MIT and Chicago, Stanford, Hopkins, and other top schools. But I've also shown it to some of my really young nieces and nephews. And it's interesting, the professors look at this and they say, well, that's easy. The monopoly money is not like the others. The others two are stores of value. And the 5-year-olds look at it and they go, that's easy. The one over on your right is not like the other because the other two are piles of paper. And so the economic question of the day is, who's smarter, a 5-year-old or a university professor? And I'll leave you with that. Okay, so what we're saying are these destruction of paper money. We've seen it before, by the way. The two times when the United States came closest to destroying its currency were both existential crises, the Revolutionary War and the Civil War. And you remember the Revolutionary War, the expression, not worth a continental, our currency was debased and worthless. And in the Civil War, the greenback was a pejorative term. It was like, again, it was kind of debased, worthless currency. But in an existential crisis, you do what you have to do. Revolutionary War, United States of America, as defined in the Declaration of Independence, would have failed. And in the Civil War, potentially the United States of America's union would have failed. So these were existential. I have no problem with central banks printing all the money they want, because what are you going to do if that can't be worse than the country actually being destroyed? Better to destroy the paper currency. But both times we bounced back. Alexander Hamilton, by the way, it never would have occurred to Hamilton, Adams, never would have occurred to any of them that you could actually have a paper money system. They understood money as silver and gold. And actually, silver played an interesting role in early American history. But to them, that was the only kind of money. And that if you had paper, it wasn't really intrinsically valuable. It was a warehouse receipt where you could go down and get some gold and silver if you wanted to. But that was just your option. It was more convenient to carry the paper. But it never occurred to them that it wouldn't be gold-backed. And after the Civil War, up through Reconstruction, President Grant put the U.S. back on a gold standard approximately where it was before the Civil War, which was highly deflationary. It was very difficult to do, but he insisted on it. And was successful in that. But that period, from Reconstruction to World War I, 1876 to 1914, the United States was on a gold standard, $20.67 an ounce of gold, pure gold. That was one of the greatest periods of prosperity in American history. And by the way, it was deflationary, but it was good deflation. It was the kind of deflation that says, you know, 10 years ago, a computer was $5,000 and now it's $500. That's 90% deflation. But we think that's good, right? Why would you fight that? Why would you try to prevent that? Well, that's the kind of deflation we had in the late 19th century as a result of productivity, invention, and technology. So don't automatically equate deflation with bad outcomes. It can be a very positive thing depending on how it's done or what causes it. Now, 1922 to 1936, we did have the gold exchange standard. This was after World War I. The gold exchange standard was generally regarded as a failure, as a contributor to the Great Depression, and it's the #1 reason why gold is discredited today. Why? By the way, I'm not a gold bug. I haven't been sitting around my basement for 25 years counting gold coins. My background is in the bond market. I got to gold by studying the paper money system. I worked for a primary dealer. I dealt directly with the Federal Reserve, an expert in the U.S. government securities market. The way I got to gold was by understanding that the paper money system was no longer going to work. But having said that, when you get there, you get there. The gold exchange standard is the #1 reason why gold is not taken seriously by most economists today, why they say you can never go back to it. It was destructive. It contributed to the Great Depression. Well, the gold exchange standard did contribute to the Great Depression. I think that's a valid analysis, but not because of gold. It was because of the price. Winston Churchill had a nostalgic affection for the pre-World War I price of gold. He thought that it was, in effect, a renege or a default of the Bank of England. And by the way, Montague Norman, the governor of the Bank of England, felt the same way, that you had to get back to that pre-World War I level. Well, they had printed so much money in World War I, there was no way to get back to that level without massive deflation of the bad kind. You've got to lower the price level a lot to make gold worth that amount of money after you've inflated the currency. You've got to make all that extra currency go away, which is highly deflationary. So it probably did contribute to the Great Depression. The solution would have been to be realistic about how much money you had created, how much paper money you had created, and say, you know what, the price of gold can never be $20 again. It ought to be $40 or $50. If you had pegged the price of gold at $50 in 1925, that would have been somewhat inflationary. We might actually have avoided the Great Depression, partly based on that, because you could have had a much larger paper money supply off the same amount of gold. So there was a failure of that gold exchange standard in the 20s and 30s, but not intrinsically because of gold, but because they set the price at the wrong level, which did cause deflation and did contribute. So it's a reason to think hard about the right way to go back on the gold standard when we get there. And then, of course, we had another period, 1944 to 1971, of the Bretton Woods gold standard. Again, 44 to 71, one of the longest, most sustained growth, most prosperous periods of American history. So I think it's interesting that two of the most prosperous periods, 1876 and 1914, 1944 to 1971, were both associated with the gold standard. We've had a lot of problems at times when we weren't on it. So let's just kind of, to answer your question, why are we a gold superpower? First of all, here's a global snapshot. The blue line is the growth of paper money, and the red line is the quantity of gold. So you can see what's going on there. We start to go up around 71 when Nixon took us off the gold standard for the last time. It really goes kind of hyperbolic closer to 2000 and continues in that mode today. So when people say gold's a bubble, how high can gold go? My point is that's an irrelevant question. Ask yourself how low the dollar can go. That's a function of how many you print. This is kind of an indicator of the price of gold. Now, when you're on a gold standard, one of the big things you have to figure out is how much gold backing relative to paper do I need? Do I want 100%? A lot of people say that. I don't think that's necessary. Do I want 40%? In the 1950s and 60s, the United States operated on 40% backing. That was the law. We had to have equivalent of $40 worth of gold for every $100 of paper money in circulation. And if you're prepared to maintain the price, you don't need 100%. You just need enough to be a credible buyer and seller, so when people want to cash in their paper for gold, you've got enough gold, and after a while people go, well, okay, you're good for it. It seems like that's a stable price, and so they're comfortable walking around with the paper money because they believe they can get the gold. And 40% is probably enough to do that. But what these bands show is that the black line would be the theoretical price of gold if you had 100% backing. The red line is the theoretical price of gold if you had 40% backing, which in my view is probably enough. The gold line is the actual price of gold. And what you see today, that gap there, is if you were going to go back on a gold standard, in order to avoid the deflationary blunder of the 1920s, in order to avoid the mistake that Churchill and Montague Norman and others made by setting the price too low, you'd have to move the price of gold up to there, somewhere in there, so that you had the right ratio in order to be non-deflationary. And that number is somewhere between $3,000 and $7,000 an ounce. So when you hear people talk about those numbers, they're not just like crazy people who are talking a position or trying to throw mud at the wall to see what sticks. It's actually a rigorous analysis. If paper money collapses, this is where you have to get back to. Now, here's the good news. These are the amount of official gold holdings. The U.S. is by far the largest, 8,133 tons. It's not all in Fort Knox. About half's in Fort Knox. The other half's in West Point. Interesting, they're all military bases. Germany is a gold power. IMF, but a lot of the IMF gold is United States gold that we gave them for our quota. Italy, believe it or not, is a gold power, and so is France. After that, it drops off really quickly. China's a bit of a pygmy. They have $3 trillion worth of our paper, but they only have about 1,000 tons of gold, which is not worth that much, certainly relative to the U.S. By the way, there are no gold powers in there. This is the rest of the world, but there's nobody in that bar that's larger than Russia at 668. In fact, quite a few are smaller. Ireland has 5 tons of gold. Greece has 100 tons of gold. I've consistently ranked Greece ahead of Ireland, partly on that basis. But if these were warheads instead of metric tons, you'd kind of like our position. And this kind of goes to your point of why I'm saying that U.S. is the Saudi Arabia of gold. This is the same thing kind of in a pie chart. Assuming we're on friendly terms with Germany, Italy, France, and the IMF, we, and Germany and the United States together, have a very decisive voice in the IMF, you can kind of sketch that out as a block, throw in Japan, they're our friends, so we probably control 2/3 of the world's gold in friendly terms. By the way, my thesis that the U.S. never went off the gold standard, we said that the dollar was no longer convertible into gold, but I believe we've been on a de facto gold standard ever since. Right now, the gold that the United States holds is worth about $350 billion at current market levels. The M1 money supply is about $1.6 trillion. You do the math, that's a 20% ratio. That's not bad, considering the amount of currency we printed. So I think it's also interesting that the United States has not sold an ounce since 1980. So for 30 years, we've held on to our gold. Our ratio is low, but it's not crazy. It's not far different than where it was at times past. I think we're on a shadow gold standard anyway, but your average central banker really can't talk about that. Okay, now interesting phenomenon. Take the 16 members of the Euro system and combine them. This is what you get. Europe, on a united basis, has 10,000 tons. So actually more than the United States. Now, obviously, Europe's got a lot of problems. But again, I like that combination of Europe, United States, IMF. You're looking at over 2/3 of the world's gold. And the pygmies are places like Russia and China. Same thing on a bar graph, again, illustrates the dominance of the major Western powers. This is gold reserves as a percentage of total reserves. Now, reserves can be in gold or they can be in hard currency. So I can have yen, sterling, Swiss francs, euros. Those can all be in my reserves. Now, what's interesting is that the United States, we're not on the gold standard, right? 72% of our reserves are in gold. We don't hold reserves in other people's paper money. We hold it in gold. I threw Greece in there for fun. Greece's problem is their total reserve position is minuscule. They happens to be 75% of it's in gold, but don't think that their reserves are anything like the United States. But look at our friends Germany, Italy, and France. This is a legacy of, not of World War I, by the way. This is the gold. In 1950, the United States had 20,000 tons. By 1970, we had 9,000 tons. Those 11,000 tons in that 20-year period went from the United States to Europe because they ran trade surpluses. We had trade deficits. That was all part of getting Europe going again after World War II. And the point is, in those days, when you had a trade surplus, you cashed in your bucks and you got gold. And that's how they did it. Charles de Gaulle, remember, sent a French destroyer to New York to pick up their gold at one point in the 1960s. And that's when Nixon kind of had second thoughts. But now the same thing happened between China and the United States between 1990 and 2010 as happened between Germany, France, and the Netherlands and the United States between 1950 and 1970. China ran the surplus, we ran the deficit. But this time, they didn't get any gold. They got paper. So, when Secretary Geithner talks about rebalancing as between consumption and investment, the Chinese, I talked to government officials in China, they're sitting there saying, wait a second, we never got the gold that Germany and France, and we got this paper, and it's a problem for us, and indeed it is. So this is, I did the doom and gloom part, but this is kind of where America, I think, has got some trump cards. This is gold as a percentage of your GDP. So let's relate gold at market prices to your economy. Now here, the United States does well, but not as well as Germany and France. Germany and France actually step up significantly ahead of us in terms of how much gold they have relative to economic activity. And again, I love Canada. Canada's a good gold producer. They have no gold in their reserves. I don't know what they do with it. But China looks very weak on a relative basis. So, let me just wrap up by saying gold has been associated with 2 very long periods of prosperity and rising living standards. Now, in a deflationary crisis, now go back to what I said earlier about the currency wars. What are you doing in a currency war? You're devaluing against the other guy. But that's temporary and it can't last, and everybody can't devalue against everybody else. So what do you do when you're the strong hands? You're the United States of America, right? Everybody wants to devalue against you because they want to export to you, but we're stuck. President Obama said he'd like to double exports in 5 years, so good luck if your dollar's strong, right? You need a weak dollar to do that. What happens when you can't devalue against the other guy and you're stuck and you're still not growing and you need those net exports? Your devaluation numeraire of last resort is gold. And this has happened twice. President Roosevelt did it in 1933, 1934. He confiscated the gold of U.S. citizens. You actually, if you had a safe deposit box, they sealed your safe deposit box. You had to make an appointment with an IRS agent who would meet you at the bank. They would unseal your box, open it. If there was gold in it, the IRS would take the gold and give you a receipt. And Fort Knox was built to hold all the gold. The Treasury had a problem. They collected so much gold, confiscated, not confiscated, but it's kind of taken in at a cheap price, put it that way. They had so much gold that they took from the American people that Fort Knox was built as a depository to hold the gold because they didn't know where to put it. Fort Knox opened in 1937. But Roosevelt took the gold at $20 and then repriced it to $35. So the United States Treasury got the 15 delta, not the American people. But it was a way to cheapen the dollar. When you couldn't cheapen it against the pound or the French franc or the German mark or the Japanese yen at the time, the president devalued it against gold, and that caused some inflation and got commodity prices up. President Nixon did the same thing in 1971. Again, another currency war where sterling broke in 67. The German mark was actually strong. That was going up. France wanted to devalue. England wanted to devalue. And Nixon wanted to devalue. And there was a limit on that, so he devalued against gold. And gold between 1971 and 1981 went from $35 an ounce to $800 an ounce. So that was actually very successful. So this is a bipartisan policy. We have Democrats and Republicans kind of willing to work together to debase the dollar. And that's, so anyway, kind of putting all this together, right? Bernanke's trying to inflate to make there's too much debt, it can't be repaid. One way to repay it is to debase the currency. The way to do that is inflation. Bernanke's trying to inflate. He's not getting the inflation because we're in a currency war with China, which we're losing at the moment. So when push comes to shove, at the end of the day, the United States will play its trump card, which is gold. We'll go back to a gold standard at something like $5,000 an ounce because that's highly inflationary, which is what we want after all. That's one way to cheapen the dollar 80%. With a snap of your fingers, just go to $5,000 gold, and that will solve the problem, and we'll pay back the Chinese $1 trillion in, tokens. So I know that sounds glib, but it's actually the history of the 20th century. The two currency wars, 1922 to 1936, 1967 to 1985 with the Plaza Accords. Both times we devalued against gold as our way out of the problem. In 1930s, the problem was debt from World War I. In the 1970s, the problem was debt from two wars, Vietnam and the war on poverty. We've got a couple of wars going on now, and the problem is actually worse. So what do we do? I think from the military perspective, you're going to see increasing civil disorder around the world. We're always seeing that. There's confusion, fear, and anxiety, dynamic instability, a lot of political backlash. One of the things that concerns me the most is we have no dry powder. People defending current fiscal policy say, you know what, the U.S. has a high debt to GDP ratio, but it's no higher than it was in 1945. And that's true, but I'm like, yeah, but in 1945, we fought and won World War II. It was an existential crisis, and we emerged as the sole, superpower. We had to share the stage with Soviet Union a little bit, but we were so dominant at that point. We actually got something for our money. It wasn't a monetary exercise, but we got something for that debt. We won the war. Now we've got the same debt level, but we haven't won any wars. I mean, we're, not any world wars. We're not the hyperpower we were in 1945. So I'm not sure what we got for our money, number one. Number two, we're now non-robust to catastrophe. What if we do have a war? What if we have a natural disaster orders of magnitude greater than Katrina? What if we have something where you say, you know what, an enlightened solution now would be to print some money. Like that would actually be a good reason to print money because we need to find a way out of this catastrophe. Well, we already did that. We already printed all this money, so I'm not sure we can print $3 trillion more. Just to summarize quickly, in extremis, and I emphasize the term in extremis, the president has extraordinary, I would say dictatorial powers, totally legal, totally constitutional, under the International Economic Emergency Powers Act of 1977, enacted during the Carter administration. It's been used time and time again. But if confronted with a national security crisis with an international aspect, and this would certainly qualify, the president can, as I like to say, seize, freeze, and don't say please. He could actually, we could send Special Operations Command, and I actually think the military should be thinking about this in contingency space. You could send a contingent to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, confiscate the gold. There's 6,000 tons buried underneath the Fed in New York. That's not our gold. That gold belongs to the rest of the world, but you could seize that gold, move it up to West Point. The U.S. at that point would have 14,000 tons. We could then start a new global currency, a new global dollar, if you will, controlled by us, backed by gold, acceptable to trade counterparts, get the economy moving again. So if you see, I think one of the reasons Bernanke may feel comfortable playing with fire is the fact that if the paper dollar collapses, we have a plan B. We have a plan B, which is to go back to gold. China has no plan B. Russia has no plan B. So we would be in a dominant relative economic position if the worst happens. So let's kind of be attentive to that. But I think that kind of contingency planning to move the foreign gold to West Point, give the Europeans a receipt, like a due bill, so you can restart the system would be a good idea. So let me finish. So here's Unified Quest 2011. To the Army's website. They are going to do a scenario of economic collapse. They're not really going to do the economics of it. They're going to kind of presuppose the collapse and then talk about operations inside the homeland to restore civil order. That's kind of, I think, good thinking ahead. And let me just end with one last clip, and then we'll go to questions. By the way, this is fictional. This is the last two I showed you were like straight news, no embellishment. This is a movie from 1981, Hume Cronin, Chris Christopherson, Jane Fonda, called Rollover, but shows you how some things never change.
For paper money that is worthless.
When the Arabs learned that word of what they've been doing is out, they may panic. Move a big chunk of funds too fast or the wrong way. Really destabilize the monetary markets. Then the dollar will collapse. Whereupon there'll be a lot of jawboning by the president, and that won't work. Then they'll go to selling gold, and that won't work either. Then they'll have to go to capital controls, freeze foreign assets, stop any money from going in or out, and that will be the end of all the markets. That'll really be the finish. Then you'll see a worldwide depression that'll make the 1930s look like a kindergarten. In 2 months, you'll have bread lines in Detroit, riots in Pittsburgh. In 6 months, you'll see grouse right over Rodeo Drive, and Michigan Boulevard, and Fifth Avenue, and I won't have done it, Hub. You will. All because you tried to stop a movement that couldn't be stopped anyway. Listen to me, Hub. Money, capital, has a life of its own. It's a force of nature, like gravity, like the oceans. It flows where it wants to flow. This whole thing with the Arabs and gold is inevitable. We're just going with the tide. The only question is whether you want to let it go like an unguided missile and raise hell, or whether you want to keep it in the hands of responsible people. Keep it channeled. Keep it quiet. Believe me, Hub, the dollar will hold. Believe me. The system will be fine, providing nobody panics.
It began 8 days ago when a group of Arab investors withdrew billions of dollars from U.S. banks. That, in turn, started a chain reaction on the world money markets. Dollars, pounds, marks, francs, yen. Not one currency escaped. This scene outside a Manhattan bank was duplicated all over the world as people saw their life savings become worthless in a matter of hours. Good evening. I'm George Page in New York, and this is another in our series of reports on the world economic crisis. The growing paralysis of the industrial world has left millions without jobs, without money, and without hope. Crowds of unemployed poured into Washington yesterday. They stood in silent protest before the nation's leaders. At the same time, more than 1 million people packed St. Peter's Square, where the Pope urged calm and nonviolence. The pontiff asked for prayers for world leaders, prayers and peace and reason. But the last 24 hours have been marked by growing protests and ever-increasing violence. Last night, demonstrators burned American currency in front of the White House, and attempts to put out the fires led to a confrontation with police. Every hour, from every corner of the globe, there are new reports of outraged crowds demanding action. A bankrupt world seems to be teetering on the very edge of anarchy.
And now for continued coverage from around the world. A statement was issued from the OPEC meeting today that the leading oil-producing nations would resume oil exports as soon as the international monetary markets have stabilized. The panic has spread across political and philosophical boundaries.
I gave a presentation in Florida once at a resort. It had a great golf course, the Blue Monster down at Doral. And when I finished, they said, well, it's time for questions. And the first person stood up and said, I don't actually have a question. I just want to thank you for ruining our day. So I'll leave it at that, but I think we do have some time for questions, Duncan.
Thank you, sir. I'm Tom Barnett with Institute for Defense Analyses. The other evening I caught something showed up on the TV there with Ben Bernanke talking to a reporter, and he was defending the QE2 effort by saying he wasn't printing money, he was merely swapping it with himself, or words to that effect. And I thought, huh? Could you explain the huh?
Sure. I hate to be didactic, but it depends on what you mean by money. What the chairman was referring to, there are different definitions of money. There's M0, which are bank reserves. There's M1, which is what happens when a bank takes the reserves and makes you a loan and credits your checking account and expands the money supply. And then there's M3, when you want to throw in different kinds of commercial paper, money market accounts. So is a money market account money? It's pretty liquid. You can usually get it out, except in October 2008 you couldn't. So what the chairman was saying is that he is increasing M0. That chart I showed you that's on its way to 3 trillion, he is increasing that. However, the M0 is a little bit sterile, meaning the banks are not taking those reserves and turning them into loans. Banks can take the reserves, turn them into loans at a rate of about 12 or 14 to 1. So his 3 trillion could turn into 40 trillion of new money. So what the chairman was saying is that the transmission mechanism has broken down. The transmission mechanism from M0 to M1 and ultimately to M3 is broken, so he feels comfortable that he's not creating money. My point is that M0 is money. As far as I'm concerned, that's money. If the chairman doesn't think it's money, that's fine. I do think it's money, but he is correct that the increase in M0 is not going anywhere. That's because velocity is declining. You're not getting that turnover. The problem is that dynamically unstable? Does there come a time when very quickly and very unexpectedly the M0 the transmission belt is not only turned on, but you floor the accelerator and the M0 turns into $15, $20 trillion of M1 very quickly. And that is what happened in the 1970s. As late as 1968, 69, inflation was only 1 or 2%, and all of a sudden hit 3%. Everyone's like, wow, it went from 1% to 3%. That looks a little scary. 2 years later, it was 8. 2 years after that, it was 12, and then it went to 13. Between 1977 and 1981, 5-year cumulative inflation was 50%. Take your dollar, cut it in half, and that's what happened in those 5 years. People said oil quadrupled. Oil didn't quadruple. The dollar collapsed, and you needed more dollars for a barrel of oil. It was still a barrel of oil. So the chairman he was not lying. He was not being disingenuous, but he was relying on a very technical distinction between M0 and M1. I hope that answers the question. Welcome.
Justin Shirk. You mentioned earlier the Federal Reserve at one point might have negative equity. What's the practical impact of that?
I think it's mostly psychological and behavioral. If you can, actually, when I mentioned that, I put that in a blog post, and a lot of the comment I got back was, well, the Fed can't go broke, they can print money. I was like, no, you don't understand. Printing money is a liability. It's not capital of the Federal Reserve, it's a liability of the Federal Reserve. So you can expand your balance sheet. What would the practical impact of the Fed having zero capital be? In the strict technical sense, probably none. There's no reason why they couldn't carry on business and keep printing money. But I think that behaviorally, psychologically, socially, and politically, it would be highly significant. It's never happened, so that's just my analysis. But I think you can argue that both ways.
Hank Malinowski, Marine Corps. I was just wondering your opinion on what Dr. Bernanke and the Treasury should have done during the 2008 meltdown. Just from what I know of Bernanke, he studied the effect of the Great Depression and probably the best guy alive to be in the job that he was. So I'm just interested in your thoughts.
I'll leave the second point aside in terms of what he could have done. The best guidance ever given for the art of central banking, and it isn't art as much as science, was from Walter Bagehot in the 19th century. He wrote a classic, he was a political scientist, lawyer, and a philosopher. He wrote a classic book called Lombard Street, which was basically a case study of central banking focused on the Bank of England. And he said, in a crisis, the central banker should do three things. He should lend freely against good collateral at a punitive rate, meaning should a central bank make money available to the banking system and the banks in a financial panic? Absolutely yes. That's what they're there for. But show me your collateral. Basically, everyone knows that banks are not robust to run on the bank. They take short-term deposits and they make long-term loans. And we all know that if all the depositors show up on one day, no bank, however well managed, could pay off all the depositors in a single day because you can't liquidate your assets that quickly. So the role of the central bank is to say, when the depositors are lined up out the door, I take my assets over to the Fed, I get some money, and I pay off my depositors. So that's the role of the lender of last resort. But it presupposes two things, that I'm solvent and that I have some assets. And that's what Bagehot meant, because putting up good collateral was a way to separate the solvent from the insolvent institutions. In other words, you've got a liquidity crisis, right? But it could turn into a solvency crisis. And the way to sort out the winners and losers in a solvency crisis is by asking them to post collateral. The third thing is charge a punitive rate. It's like, General Electric, you need $12 billion? Fine, no problem. I'll wire the money to your account, but I'm going to charge you 6%. It's not going to be free. And in the crisis, the Fed only followed one of those three rules. You know that Meatloaf song, 2 out of 3 ain't bad. The Fed got 1 out of 3. They lent freely, but not against good collateral and not at a punitive rate. So the moral hazard spread, there was no signal to the financial system that, if you come to us, here's the money, but we're kind of like loan sharks, it's going to cost you a lot. And it's interesting that under Dodd-Frank, the Fed was required to disclose who got the money. They were not required to disclose the collateral. The collateral is still secret. There are Freedom of Information Act requests pending on that. But it looks like Citibank in particular was allowed to pledge some like CC bonds at par, which is a gift. And so, the short answer to your question is, I would have, as a central banker, I would have lent to a lot of institutions. I would have lent enormous amounts of money. I would have created a lot of money. I would have been rigorous about the collateral. I would have charged high rates. By the way, that money goes to the taxpayers. See, when you charge, if you should charge 5%, you charge 0. That's a gift from the taxpayer to General Electric. If you charge 5%, it's money going from General Electric to the taxpayer. So the taxpayers were depleted in order to finance major institutions who were reckless. That's not something that I think goes down well in democracy, and very few people understand it, by the way. And there should have been more failure. J.P. Morgan would have come through fine. Maybe General Electric needs to come through with a little slap on the wrist or whatever. Citibank should have been nationalized. Goldman Sachs probably. The firms that actually were in line to fail, that were not solvent. Here's what you do. You take Citibank as an example. You nationalize it, but it's still open the next day, right? It's still operating. The lights are on. Everyone can go get their money. The ATMs work. You're not shutting it down, but you nationalize it. You say bondholders, you get 0. Stockholders, you get 0. U.S. taxpayers now own it. You go in and you lift out the bad assets and you put them in a black hole, right? Because the government has no cost of funds and no mark to market. So you put these bad assets over there. You hire people like me to work it out for you. I'm in that business. Then you take this clean bank and you IPO it exactly the way they did with General Motors the other day. You IPO it back, but it's a clean bank. Now it can lend. Now it can do business. Now it can grow the economy. You got rid of the rot. None of that was done. There was too much cronyism, too much of a desire to prop up the elites, prop up their friends, not let the chips fall where they will. Not completely, but to some extent to get this behind us. As a result, the system superficially looks better because these institutions are still standing, but the rot is still on the balance sheet and the economy is going nowhere.
I'm Mitzi Worth. I'm with the Naval Postgraduate School. I have sort of two crazy questions. One is, how does this relate to having jobs, the whole money game? And the other one is, have you seen Inside Jobs?
Haven't seen Inside Job. Tried to buy it on Amazon last night, but I guess it's not out yet. So I'll see that maybe before Christmas. I hear it's pretty good. I have
to tell you, I came away in such a set of rage. My view is all of them should be behind bars, looking at the consequence of what they've done to the entire global economy. And we sort of say, well, I mean, it's all these guys sort of taking care of each other and forgetting the rest of us.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think one of the problems is that there aren't more people behind bars. I think there should be, but there's an interesting dynamic there, which is Ever since Drexel in 1990 and Arthur Andersen in 2000, the lesson is if you indict a financial firm, they fail. In other words, instead of innocent until proven guilty, you actually fail immediately because as a counterpart, as a depositor, as an investor, I want no part. I don't want my money at the scene of your train wreck. So when you indict a financial firm, they fail. But we know there's a set of institutions that are too big to fail. We know who they are. And so you're in this conundrum where maybe you broke the law and I want to indict you, but if I indict you, you fail. You're too big to fail, therefore I can't indict you. Therefore, you're beyond the law. It's like the Justice Department won't go after them because it means that the institutions that they just saved are going to collapse. So it's almost like you're above the law, which is, again, very contrary to a lot of our democratic principles. What was the first part? How do you create jobs? That's the easy one. Great companies like IBM, General Electric do not create jobs. They destroy jobs. They do it by mergers and acquisitions. They acquire smaller companies. They put that product on a global platform, generate revenues. You need about like $5 billion to move the needle at IBM. But you don't need 2 CEOs, 2 CFOs, 2 general counsels. So you destroy jobs, you increase your revenues, and that's fine. That's an okay business model. Jobs come from small business. They come from entrepreneurs. I hired a guy in California. I created one more job than the White House in the past year. So it's true. So that's where jobs come from. Now, what do you need to kind of get a businessman to step up and take risks? You need sound money, kind of low taxation, and light regulation. What are we getting? Debased money, higher taxation, and more regulation. So we've got the formula to suppress job growth. Therefore, unemployment should come as no surprise.
Can I just add on to that? What I'd like to know is what are the tasks, i.e. the jobs, that people could do in the United States, that someone in the United States would pay them to do?
Well,
I mean, I talk about small businesses, people who do nails or salons or restaurants.
Well, there's nothing wrong with those jobs. Those are good jobs. But the answer to your question is that we don't know, and that's the point, right? 6 years ago, no one ever heard of an iPhone, right? That just came out of somebody's idea, Italian design, Chinese assembly, U.S. technology. That's precisely the point. You don't know where the jobs are coming from. What you do need to do is create an environment in which that kind of innovation can take place and then see what happens. But we've got I talk to CEOs, and they just want to create jobs in this country. Well, the U.S. has a hostile business climate. By the way, this is not unique to Obama. This goes back to the Bush administration as well, that CEOs tell me the U.S. has a hostile business environment that they'd rather be in India. I mean, IBM is creating, they're hiring 10,000 people a month in India, and they're shutting down 10,000 jobs a month in the U.S. So their net employment's not changing much, but it's gone all towards India. Those jobs could be in the United States.
Len Bracken, BNA. Could you talk a little bit about the money market run in 2008 and how vulnerable are the money market funds these days?
It was a run. That's the best way to describe it. And basically, there was a large commercial, multi-trillion-dollar commercial paper market. A lot of corporations use the commercial paper market to fund their activities. Now, one of the things that's going on today that's kind of interesting is that corporate balance sheets have the most cash in history. They have several $1 trillion of cash. And a lot of stock analysts say, that's great. Look at all that money on the sideline. They'll be doing M&A. They'll be expanding. They'll be buying their stock back and all that great. And the answer is no. That is not a sign of strength. That's a sign of fear. You don't have that much cash unless you're worried about something. And what they're worried about is that the commercial paper market will shut down, and they'll have to fund their operations for 6 or 8 months on their own dime that they're not going to bail out the commercial paper market again. So the reason corporations have all that cash is that it's not a source of strength. It's a source of weakness because they're worried that they're going to have to finance internally without the help of the banking system. So that's a real problem there. But it goes back to this gentleman's question, which is, I'm obviously being very critical of Bernanke, and there's the counterfactual. Well, what would you have done? Would you have let unemployment go to 20%? Well, I would have had a lot more failure than we had to clear out some of the rot. But there are some places where you have to draw the line. Money market funds are one of them, because American people treat money market funds the way they used to treat FDIC insured deposits. They assume that a dollar is a dollar is a dollar. And if you let those go down, then you really have nothing left. So I'm not averse to kind of bailing out the money markets, which is what happened in 2008. But I wouldn't have bailed out everybody, and I wouldn't have given the money away for free.
Hello, Matthew Kiefer. 2 questions. One, what do you look for to know that your predictions for the gold future are coming? And 2, if you're not the US or France or Italy or one of the gold superpowers you mentioned, if you're China or someone else, what do you do to try and change the rules of the game so that doesn't happen?
The first one, I don't do predictions. I do dynamic systems analysis. So it's kind of like letting go of the pen. I mean, this is how I analyze it. And again, there's a lot of science behind the method. So I'm happy to talk about that. But I am a big believer in contingency and conditionality. And as I think there are a set of policies that could pivot away from some of the outcomes I described. The reason I describe the outcomes is I give a very low probability to the policies. In other words, if the White House and the Congress got together and said, here's the deal, we're going to do a flat tax, no deductions, 15% top rate, and we're eliminating 3 cabinet level departments in total. Some of the, if they're good programs, we'll push them down to the states, send them a check, but the bureaucracy in Washington is over. Get us on a sustainable spending. If that announcement came out, I'd say, I'd go out and buy stocks tomorrow. I'd be happy with my dollars because I think I'd probably sell my gold. In other words, that could happen, but I give it a probability close to 0. And so the reason I talk about the things I talk about is not because that has to happen, but that's what I see unfolding in the dynamic. And the second part of your question, I'm sorry, what? Yeah, okay, I'll tell you what China's doing. The market in gold is very, very, first of all, they look at the same charts, right? They know they're behind. They know China's basically short 3,000 tons. When I say short, I don't mean short the market. I mean, that's how much they need to get parity. Just go back to the Cold War and Russian, U.S., or Soviet U.S. warheads and parity and START and all that stuff we went through. Imagine the same analysis applied to gold, right? Right now, there's no parity in gold relative to GDP. China is woefully short, so they need about 3,000 tons. The market in gold is very, very thinly traded. Like you can go down to your dealer and buy, 100 gold coins and for 14,000 or whatever, and stick it under your mattress. But you call J.P. Morgan, London, and order 10 tons, and they'll just laugh at you. So you can't move that much physically. You can move paper gold. COMEX gold, London Bullion Market Association forward contracts. You can do paper gold. That's an inverted pyramid with a little gold at the bottom and a big open interest in paper contracts. If everybody wanted to cash in, could not be done. What they would do is halt trading and send you a check. You'd get a $1 check for your profit or loss, but no gold. So China can't go out and just put out, or they are doing this, by the way. Interesting, they went, until 2009, they officially had 500 tons, and in one day they went to 1,000 tons. They didn't buy 500 tons in one day. They sent secret agents out around the world, and they spent 5 years acquiring the 500 tons in stealth. And what they did is they put it in the books of something called SAFE, State Administration for Foreign Exchange, which is different from the central bank. They accumulated a 500-ton position, and then in a single accounting entry, they flipped it to the People's Bank of China and then disclosed it as part of the reserves as a show of strength. But again, they took 5 years of stealth acquisition to do that. So what they're doing is they've captured their own mining system. China's the largest gold producer in the world, throwing off about 300 tons a year. Total global output's about 2,200 tons. So they're more than 10% of the output of the entire world. And what they're saying to their miners is, hey, your production costs are about $500 an ounce. Price of gold is $1,400. We're going to buy all of your output on a captive basis at $1,000 an ounce. If you don't like it, too bad, we'll shut you down or take you over. So the miners are making good profits, not as much as they would in a free market. And the benefit for China, they're getting the gold. That gold is never showing up in the world market. They're not having to transact in the London bullion market. They've captured their own miners. They're taking it directly and putting it in vaults. Russia's doing the same thing. So people go, oh, okay, 300 tons a year, 10 years, they catch up. The answer is no. 2 problems. Number one, their economy is growing so quickly that the 3,000-ton bogey today is going to be 7,000 tons in 10 years, so they're never going to get there fast enough. And number two, their mining practices are totally unsound. They're depleting their mines. They're probably going to run out in about 4 years. So this might be good for 1,000, 1,500 tons or something like that, but I mean, the way you get gold, you use a lot of cyanide. They're just dumping cyanide into the rivers. So it's a non-sustainable process. So the answer is they're transacting off market.
So about a year, 18 months ago, we were coming up with the Troubled Asset Relief Program. That was going to buy up all those dodgy mortgages and stuff, or at least get them off the books. What happened, and where are we?
Actually, I'm actually in that business with some partners trying to buy distressed assets from the FDIC. The answer is they never bought the assets. Secretary Paulson sold that to the Congress as a $800 billion fund that was going to be used to buy the bad assets off the banks. But once the Congress approved it, they never did that. It was the ultimate bait and switch. What they did do was take the $800 billion and give it to the banks, their buddies, and as capital to support the assets on the balance sheet. But the assets are still on the balance sheets of the banks. They haven't gone anywhere by and large. Now, I go in, I'm in this business, and a typical scenario, by the way, there's like $1 trillion of commercial real estate on the books of the community banks. So let's say what these did, the banks made the loans to these real estate developers because they thought they were going to sell them to Lehman Brothers, right? And then all of a sudden that window shut, and they're like, oh my goodness, this is stuck on my books. They probably marked it down from 100 to 90. We're buyers at 50. That's about what it's worth, on a stretch, 51 maybe. So I talk to bankers every day. We go in and say, well, pay you 51 cents on the dollar for this loan. They're like, well, I got it marked at 90. I'm like, yeah, but it's worth 50. And they're like, yeah, but I can't take the impairment. I would love to sell it to you at 50, but I'd have to take a 40-point impairment charge, which will wipe out my capital, and the FDIC will shut me down. So even though I like you and I want to sell it to you, I can't because I'll go broke. So the answer is nothing's happening. The assets are still there. That's why banks can't lend, because their balance sheets are cluttered up with all this garbage. It's breaking up slowly, but really slowly, really, really slowly. And that's one of the reasons the economy is not growing, because the banks can't lend because they're stuffed to the gills with bad assets.
I'm going to take one more and that's
Peter.
it. Peter Scharfman, Miter Corporation. I'd like to go back to your counterfactual of what you think a central banker should have done and ask on what basis you would draw the line. To a first approximation, what the government did with General Motors was it wiped out the stockholders and made everybody else whole. And got a lot of criticism for making everybody else whole. But if you aren't going to, if you're going to attack the debtors, the creditors, especially the contingent creditors, where do you draw the line? Where do you say, well, wait a minute, money market funds are in one category, but what used to be AAA bonds are in a different category?
Right. Well, as I said, the central bank is more art than science, and so it would inevitably be subjective. It would inevitably be imperfect. But I think the government is very, very good at toting up the first-order benefits, and they're very bad at calculating the second-order costs. And I would have had a lot more failure. The thing is, with what I'm describing, unemployment probably would have gone up like closer to 20%. And then we say, well, gee, it's 9%. You say 20%. So that's ipso facto a worse outcome. My answer is it's a worse outcome for 18 months, and then you start growing again, and people are encouraged by that. Whereas instead, because to me the counterfactual, not the counterfactual, but the play out the tape, people talk about a V, like they don't have the courage of their convictions because the V is like way down here, but then you get this robust growth, and everyone's saying, where's the growth? The answer is we never had the V because policy truncated it. Go back to that housing bubble slide. Policy can put a floor under things, but they can't make things grow. And so I think, yes, what I'm describing would have been a lot worse in 2008 and 2009. I can't argue that. It certainly would have been. And that's the counterfactual Bernanke uses to justify what he did. But he ignores the cost of what he did. The cost of what he did is 10 years of no growth.
Thank you very much, Jim.
Thank you.